In 2008, the Vancouver Art Gallery exhibited Crazy, the delirious world of anime, comics, video games, and art. Among the exhibit's curation group was video game designer Will Wright, best known as the creator of The Sims. During the exhibition, Wright hosted a lecture where he offered his insight on the artistic value of video games. James Huck and Chris Remo of Game Developer reported, "Game designers suffer from film envy," postulated Wright, "and many of them want to be film directors." The designer pointed out that the film director knows the future and can show a relevant causal chain. Games do not tell linear stories in the same way films can because of the player's involvement. Furthermore, in his masterclass course on game design and theory, Wright elaborates,
"The emotional palette of film is totally based upon empathy. You can look at characters and they're basically pretending to have emotions, and we're empathizing with those emotions. And so when they feel sad, we feel that sadness. When they're happy, we feel happy. Games, the emotional palette is based upon agency. The fact that I did it, that I'm responsible, I have accountability, I'm the one that pushed the joystick in that direction."
Wright proposes that games fundamentally have an incompatible emotional palette with film. But what if there was a game that was unapologetically designed with film sensibilities, and yet retained all the things that made it an interactive experience? What if this game, instead of further separating both narrative mediums, advocated that they should intermingle more? What if this game embraced the notion of film envy entirely? Today we'll examine such a game, Odd Meter's 2024 absurdist adventure, INDIKA. Set in an alternate history Russia during the 19th century, INDIKA follows its titular character as she struggles with a crisis of faith. INDIKA is a nun who hears the devil.
"Open it. See for yourself."
No. Reading someone else's letter is a greater sin than not delivering it.
Greater? How much greater?
After an hallucinatory episode where she knocks over a priest, INDIKA is tasked to leave her convent until she delivers a letter to a neighboring monastery. It is through INDIKA's personal journey where the game discusses themes of faith, authority, and metaphysics. Though the game's narrative and subject matter are presented excellently, this analysis will focus on how INDIKA adapts film theory into its core identity. INDIKA demonstrates how to properly synthesize the narrative mediums of video games and film through its appropriate use of cinematography and adaptation of genre iconography. Perhaps the most appropriate response in analyzing INDIKA and narrative-driven games is viewing it as an example of post-cinema. In Perspectives on Post-Cinema, an introduction, Shane Denson and Julia Leda define post-cinema as younger media that emphasize that they are essentially digital, interactive, networked, ludic, miniaturized, mobile, social, processual, algorithmic, aggregative, environmental, or convergent, among other things. The most pressing and relevant characteristics of post-cinema in regard to gaming are its interactive and ludic attributes. Traditionally, the experiencer of film is a passive spectator. No action he, she, or they make can influence the predetermined narrative unfolding on screen. In contrast, video games differ because the player is the singular driving force of the narrative. Depending on the game, the player can make decisions that will significantly affect the story's outcome. The player can choose to progress the game linearly or skip certain sections, and it is the player's responsibility to solve puzzles and challenges before progressing the narrative. In regard to the topic of film envy, AAA developed games often compare their cinematic scope against film. Take for example the North American advertising campaign for Final Fantasy VII. Television commercials for the game marketed as a summer blockbuster, even going as far as hiring a voice-over artist to emulate the rumbling baritone of Don LaFontaine.
And now, the most anticipated epic adventure of the year will never come to a theater near you.
However, the cinematic aspect of video games should not simply conclude as a desire to supersede traditional cinema, but rather demonstrate how to push the visual medium further. Denson and Leda propose, post-cinema asks us to think about new media not only in terms of novelty, but in terms of an ongoing, uneven, and indeterminate historical transition. Again, one might identify this transition in Final Fantasy VII. The game opens with a cinematic, featuring the character Aerith Gainsborough emerging from an alleyway. Notice the camera movement here. The composition begins with the dolly out, then moves further with a crane out, and finally pulls the camera even further back with an establishing shot that can only be taken from a helicopter. A long continuous take like this, which uses 3 different camera rigs, is impossible to film practically, yet the affect of grandeur and magnanimity it bestows is undeniable. This opening sequence pushes traditional filmmaking techniques to a hypothetical extreme, and in doing so enhances the emotional effect. In contrast, INDIKA isn't as ambitious with its cinematics. In fact, the game primarily grounds itself in practical filmmaking techniques. These include the use of an emulated Snorri-cam mount on INDIKA's model, reminiscent of the disorienting close-ups featured in Darren Aronofsky's Requiem for a Dream. How INDIKA and Ilya are blocked on the train ride scene, implying a sense of isolation and emotional distance. And the numerous Dutch tilts seen throughout the game. It is ironic that these cinematic elements are so noteworthy because even though they are well established in film, they are rarely seen in video games to this extent. During gameplay, INDIKA may encounter rest areas that offer establishing shots of the area she is in. The compositions of these vignettes emulate depth of field and focal length distortion, as if shot through a real camera lens. Instead of rejecting the visual conventions of film, INDIKA embraces its influence with sincerity by honoring the art house sentiments that lie in its foundation. In both the realms of gaming and cinema, certain visual elements carry a weight of meaning to them. A sword is a symbol of masculinity, a mask is a symbol of the alter ego, and trains are a symbol of transition. Presented here are examples of what Thomas Schatz considers as iconography. Of course, there are iconographic symbols that are unique to their respective genres. As Schatz writes, a genre's iconography reflects the value system that defines its particular cultural community and informs the objects, events, and character types composing it. Each genre's implicit system of values and beliefs, its ideology or worldview, determines its cast of characters, its problems, and the solution to those problems. Naturally, INDIKA borrows motifs from film's visual language. Color grading is used to communicate a specific emotional tone. The scene where INDIKA surrenders to her temptation of opening the letter is a striking example, reminiscent of the duotone scenes found in 2001: A Space Odyssey and Suspiria. Moreover, INDIKA also uses video game genre iconography as analogs to ones found in film. The game features short minigame sections where the hyper-realistic 3D graphics and perspective are replaced with 2D pixel art. These vignettes are flashbacks to INDIKA's past before she became a nun. By using this retro aesthetic, INDIKA evokes the iconography of black and white or sepia tone scenes found in predominantly colored films. Both intuitively communicate a sense of nostalgia, memory, and retrospect. Finally, INDIKA handles its own interpretation of exclusive video game iconography cleverly. Unique to video games are the icons of points and collectibles. Whether as intrinsic or extrinsic rewards, players are primed to obtain these, even going as far as suspending the narrative to do so. At its onset, INDIKA immediately establishes what it calls devotion points, and keeps a consistent record of how many points the player has obtained. When certain point milestones have been reached, the player is taken to a progression tree and can earn bonuses that affect his, her, or their score. Devotion points are obtained by either completing quests, lighting reliquaries, or finding religious icons. The irony of all this is that the points don't serve any gameplay or narrative function. They don't influence INDIKA's strength or unlock new skills for her. Even the game's loading screen explicitly tells the player not to bother with collecting the points. Yet therein lies the inherent paradox of INDIKA's reward system, that even though there is no reason to veer off the narrative path, players will undoubtedly find himself, herself, or themselves compelled to do so anyway. This is compounded at the game's denouement, where the player is forced to watch all the points he, she, or they had collected up to then tick away. INDIKA's devotion points are a direct deconstruction of the value system found in this particular facet of video game genre iconography. It still carries its own thematic significance. INDIKA proposes that narratological games should not reject nor envy the filmmaker's toolset, and should instead adapt and transliterate the visual language of cinema. The inverse is true, as film can adapt narrative elements of games. In DVDs, video games, and the cinema of interactions, Richard Grusin recounts that films like Groundhog Day, Run Lola Run, Extend, and Femme Fatale have begun to experiment with recursive, game-like narrative logics instead of more conventional linear narratives. Run Lola Run, in particular, actually inspired The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask gameplay loop of rewinding time to the beginning of a 3-day cycle, as mentioned in an editorial from Polygon. INDIKA stands as a compelling example of how the boundaries between film and video games can be blurred to create a profound experience. It advocates for a future where both mediums can continuously learn from and enhance each other, pushing the narrative and visual boundaries of storytelling. Games like INDIKA prove that embracing film envy can lead to a richer, more immersive, and emotionally resonant form of interactive media.